Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for bearing with me during this time. We've had a bit of an incident. I don't know what's going on with the live streaming. So I'm just going to be go ahead and putting this out there. I'll go ahead and do the regular lesson, and then I'll just upload it to YouTube separately. For whatever reason, I don't know what's going on. Maybe it's just the school's internet not letting me do a live stream. Where I have to go ahead and just do this separately and then upload it later on. Because I had tried it from my house last night, and it was working just fine. It went ahead up on my second YouTube account, my personal one, and that was fine, all fun and dandy. I had to actually go back in and go back into my account and delete everything. But it did work. However, here at the school, it's not. So I'll probably end up spending the rest of my afternoon building a bit of a movie studio at my own house, so we don't have to do anything like this again. I won't actually have to come to the classroom. Few things to know. I will be available from 9 a.m. until 12 p.m., so 3 hours each day. You can actually send me, this is where I'll be responding to emails, any concerns, questions you've got. If I need to be calling parents for whatever reason, if you're not doing your work, then I'll be doing it during that time. Rather 8 through 11 instead of 9 through 11. But let's go ahead and get started. So today is our fourth day with agriculture. We're going to be looking at agricultural challenges. So the bell ringer was on Google Forms. It's actually the second slide you're seeing. And the question was, what is a crop or a type of agriculture we have here in Louisiana? And what are the challenges that farmers in this type of agriculture may or may not face? So at this point, go ahead, put it on pause, go to the next slide in Nearpod, which is a Google form, fill that out, do a little bit of brainstorming, and after that, you can go ahead and move forward. So here we go. Take 5 minutes and pause now. All right, so some of your answers you may have come up with were beef, cotton, dairy, as you know, Klein Peter Farms here in Baton Rouge. Rice is big, especially around Opelousas, Lafayette area. There's a lot of rice growing. Soybeans are big up north in the state. Strawberries around Ponchatoula. Sugarcane, really big, especially along the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya rivers, especially going down parts like Reserve, Laplace. Lots of sugar industry. And the one thing you might not have realized was we also have a very big timber industry. If you're driving on Interstate 12 through Livingston Parish and through Tangiboa Parish and Washington Parish, a lot of that land is actually owned by timber companies. They grow pine, and then they'll cut it down and use that pine to actually go ahead and produce that for lumber. So that could go to the frame of someone's house. It could also be actually rolled out and turned into plywood, but it's a major thing. So companies like Weyerhaeuser, other lumber companies, I think Georgia Pacific does some with lumber and some with paper, all that together. That's all big across the Interstate 12 corridor. Some problems they face might include one, economic decline, because as you have probably noticed, given that where we are with this coronavirus outbreak, we have seen a lot of economics come to a standstill. We've had the stock market dropping because people are not doing business. That kind of economic decline, although we don't like to think about it, don't tend to think about it, it does affect our farmers. Let's face it, McDonald's, something like that one. Tomatoes, lettuce, everything that goes onto a hamburger, those are things that farmers have to produce. And if they are not able to sell the stuff, then the farming is going to slow down tremendously. The beef patty, cows, beef, that's going to slow down as well. So once you start seeing restaurant closures, you're actually going to be seeing a lot of hard times for those farmers. So fingers crossed that we can end this thing as quickly as possible before it gets too terrible. Another one is going to be environmental issues. We'll be seeing this one to a degree towards the end of this program, the end of this lesson. Environmental issues such as droughts, rain, floods. 2016, if you were a farmer, it kind of hurt you. I'm not going to lie, because all this trash, all this sewage, runoff from, say, oil, other things, gasoline, that went into the environment, into the water, and that caused a number of plants and animals to be affected by it. Some of the crops were just completely wiped out for that entire year after the flood. In fact, that December, I know a bunch of people who were growing satsumas and other citrus. Because of that flood, they were not able to actually produce that. The trees produce a lot of fruit, but when they went over to cut the fruit off and take a look at it, it was actually rotting on the inside. And that was residue from the flood. It got sucked up into the plant's roots, and while it didn't kill the plant, it made the fruit completely inedible for that season. We also have competition from other farmers. The good news is this one, it's not exactly a major problem. In fact, a lot of farmers, especially in Louisiana, have been forming what they call co-ops, which is essentially a farmers' trade union, where different farmers can get together. They can actually set plans for how much of their fields are going to be planting, how much their work they're going to be doing to it, and also setting market prices. So they can actually go in together and cooperate. So we call that a co-op. So competition from other farmers does happen, but it's not a major problem nowadays. And lastly, we have trade issues. No doubt you remember a little over a year ago, there was talk of this trade war with China. United States and China were trying to renegotiate trade deals, and the Chinese were not too thrilled with it. And what the Chinese did was their government decided that they would stop importing soybeans. Needless to say, Louisiana farmers were affected by that. So even something that you wouldn't think, international geopolitics, that can, in fact, affect your in-state agriculture. So those trade issues are a major thing. All right, next up. So let's look first at developing countries on the next slide. And someone just buzzed in. Okay, so on the screen, this is the fifth slide of Nearpod. And this is going back to our demographic transition model. We're looking at stages 2 and 3, developing countries. So we see stage 2, high birth rate, and the death rate starts lowering. And with stage 3, the death rate stays low and the birth rate starts lowering. So what are some challenges? I want you to brainstorm this one. Take a minute or so. Pause the video and brainstorm what challenges do you think farmers in those two stages, stage 2 and 3, are going to be encountering. Go ahead and pause it now. Think about it. And when you're ready to submit your answer, go ahead, unpause, and then you will go to the next slide. So the next slide as you're seeing, this is slide 6, is fill in the blank. Go ahead and take care of that one real quick. Fill out what you think you know. Build your knowledge on this one. I'll give you a minute. If you need to pause it, go ahead. Okay, so you're done with that, and your fill in the blank should look something like this. Farmers in developing countries have the responsibility of feeding a growing population. However, they're often pressured by their governments to grow crops for export instead of feeding their families and communities. Needless to say, this is a bit of a problem. Simply put, farmers in developing countries are forced to meet two needs at the same time. And they're forced to do that by using the exact same land. Because let's face it, these governments aren't going to be giving you, as a farmer, an additional 20 acres of land to work. Even if they did, you still don't have a lot of time. Because you have to take care of your family and your community. You're not going to be able to produce anything for export. So, farmers have to substantially increase their crop production. So how do you think they do that? What do you think they need? Brainstorm a bit. All right, so remember Thomas Malthus. Remember that guy? Malthus said way back when that as your population increases in an area, then eventually you're going to start running out of food. Needless to say, we've realized that that doesn't really jive because, let's face it, as people grow, as our populations grow, we're able to develop new technologies as well as new methods of farming. So we are able to actually produce a lot more crops in a certain area. We have tractors, we have fertilizers, we have all sorts of different things, new methods. We have crop rotations to make sure that we're not depleting the land. And that's where this woman comes in. Her name is Esther Boserup, and she has what's called the theory of agricultural intensification, also called, because her name is Boserup, the Boserup thesis. So on your next slide, here's a brief video. Go ahead and play the video, and here we go. Once we're done with the video, I'll go ahead and pick up from there. All right, so on the next slide after the video, Boesrup's thesis is fill in the blanks. But when a population increases, more food is needed to support them. However, the new population is able to create new forms of labor, new technology, and new farming methods, and forces a switch to intensive agriculture. So in this case, they're able to double down on the agriculture and actually be able to make things work a little bit easier, a little bit better for everyone involved. So they can go ahead and actually make these changes as needed, make these technological changes, as well as be able to switch over from extensive to intensive. However, there's one problem with this, and that is the lack of fallow. So you might want to take a note on this one. Fallow is when you do crop rotation, one part of the land is left unplanted so that over that certain period of time, nutrients can be replenished into the soil. And this is necessary in crop rotation because that fallow period or that fallow area is actually meant to be held aside. Because if you try growing on all of your land at the same time, eventually all those crops are actually going to be sucking all the nutrients out of the soil, and it makes the soil no more good. So Boesrup's theory means that you have to you allow less time for these fallow areas because you're constantly wanting to improve the soil. Now, in some cases, that's not a problem. You can bind fertilizers. You can buy different things. You can also do composting to go ahead and put that stuff back into the soil. In some cases, I know some people, actually, if you have a mixed-use farm, they'll actually take bedding, soil bedding, because let's face it, cows and goats, they go into their stalls, they're not exactly trained to leave their stall and go do their business outside. So you take that bedding and that animal waste, and you can actually move it back to your area, till it up, put that in there, and that helps put nutrients back in the soil. So, international trade. Here's our other issue. Developing countries need certain things to produce these items. They need, one, technology. They need to get it from somewhere else. Let's face it, if you're living in some place in Ethiopia and you want to buy a tractor to do more farming, there aren't a lot of tractors in Ethiopia. So you're going to have to look at other places maybe like India. One company that builds tractors in India is Mahindra, and they also sell it here in the United States. They sell worldwide. Toyota actually makes tractors from Japan. Here in the United States, we've got companies like John Deere. We've got Case, or Case IH, which is International Harvester. Those places, they'll be happy to sell you certain things. They can also export them to other countries. But to get those tools, that new technology, you are going to have to need money. Because sadly, the old adage of money makes the world go round, it is sadly true, especially in third world countries. So to get money, they need to grow more crops to export. But at the same time, to grow more crops, they need to get money to buy those tools and those fertilizers. So naturally what you're seeing is a vicious cycle. And these farmers stay in debt almost 24/7 for the rest of their lives. They need money to produce a crop. They need the crop to sell to get more money. So here's our issue. There's a bit of a problem here, and that problem is, well, I'll let you think about it for a second. So put yourself in the situation of a developing country. This is slide 13. This is a short answer. constructed response. Let's say you are in the situation of a farmer in a developing country. Maybe you're in Western Asia, maybe you're in Sub-Saharan Africa, maybe you're in South America. But you need to grow crops to export and get money. But if you're doing that, you have less land to grow food. But if you don't grow enough food, you can't be able to survive and import this new technology or chemicals. So what would you do, and what do you think they do? So go ahead and go to the slide. Take about 2 minutes, and then we'll move on. You can go ahead and pause it here, and pause the video, answer the question, and then when you're ready to move on, hit unpause, and we'll go forward. Well, now that you've answered that question, here's what they do. They turn to illegal drugs. So this is reality for a number of farmers in developing countries. They need to have one specific cash crop that they can sell for a high price in order to import more of the tech and more of the fertilizers and supplies that they need to feed themselves. So one of the most ones that's got a lot of demand for it is drugs. Places like Colombia, Peru, Bolivia produce coca, which ends up being processed into cocaine. Afghanistan, Myanmar, Laos, they produce heroin and opium. And as you can see in the picture on the slide, they're producing it from poppy fields. These poppy flowers, you can actually extract the juice, the milk from those, and be able to process that into heroin as well as opium. Needless to say, you've probably know that we have the massive opium epidemic here in the United States. People are overdosing, trying to get their next high, next fix. And as a result, what's happening is these farmers, they're producing it. Simply put, they have no other options. They have to produce it, because if they don't, there's no way they can work on their own fields to actually produce the food they need for them and their communities to survive. So they're doing commercial agriculture, commercial illegal drugs in order to support their subsistence living, subsistence farming. Marijuana comes largely from Mexico, although there have been some other marijuana growers. In fact, the entire one of the biggest pushes for marijuana legalization was to try to eliminate these illegal drugs, to try to make it legal and possibly help out the people who are actually farming it. So they can actually have an open market and they can actually lift themselves up out of poverty. Needless to say, while marijuana might be on that path, and it's been on the path in a number of states, things like heroin and cocaine are still going to be tightly regulated. Especially heroin, because opium and as well as morphine are both derived from the poppy plants as well. And those are both used in hospitals as a actual painkiller. But it is tightly regulated, and you can't just have it flowing out. People start dosing themselves with it, and unfortunately, they don't get the dosage right, and they overdose. So that is one of our main problems here. Okay, so your next slide is going to be a video. It's actually a CNN video from Afghanistan. What's happening here in Afghanistan is, because of this growth of opium, a number of people in Afghanistan, these Afghan people are actually starting to use it themselves. And we're seeing massive amounts of addiction happening. So here's a brief video. Go ahead and watch it. It's only about 2 to I think maybe 3 minutes at the most. So I'm going to go ahead and pause. You can pause this YouTube video here and watch the link, the video in the Nearpod link. Here you go.
In a park in downtown Kabul, huddled under the trees, are a group of Afghans ignored by society. With a syringe in one hand,
All right, so we know that drugs are bad. Next slide over. Especially now that we in the United States are in the middle of an opioid crisis. The question here is, how can we discourage the production of drugs if those drugs are the only steady source of income for a developing nation? So you can go ahead and pause this video here, answer the question. Once you've submitted, you can unpause and we'll go forward. All right, so we've seen what challenges developing countries face. But now let's look at the other side of the equation, developed countries. So developing countries like Afghanistan, you've got lots of poverty. You also have a lot of farmers trying to get by, so they start producing drug crops. Well, developed countries have a different problem. We overproduce food. Too much food goes into the market, and if you know anything about supply and demand, my civics students from last year, you would know that as a supply goes up, if the demand cannot meet that supply, then the price drops. So here's the supply and demand curve. Go ahead and look at it, because this is going to be affecting us in developed countries. So if a developed country's food supply is high, as you can see here, that supply is high. As the supply rate goes up, unless that demand goes up as well, your price is going to drop. So if the supply is up and the demand is low, it's going to be overpriced. And to meet that demand, you're going to have to drop that price. If the demand is high and the supply stays the same, then the price of those crops goes up. So if we're overproducing food, where do you think the price is going to land? Yeah, should be down, a lower price. So in developed countries, we typically see an overproduction of food, because commercial farms can supply so much food, the demand is typically low and prices remain low. This is where we get to our second part of this, called the von Thunen model, also known as the law of rural land use. When a farmer plants any type of crop, they have to take a few things into consideration. One, the cost of their land, not just in whether they're paying a mortgage or rent, but also the cost of maintaining that land, the cost of actually putting in the work and capital into it, such as fertilizers, feed, all that goes into it. Because let's face it, when you're a farmer, you calculate everything that goes into it. And two, the cost of transportation. So the von Thunen model actually takes a look at this one and says, hey, you know what? If farmers are producing agriculture closer to the city, they're going to start producing the stuff that costs more to move, to transport from one place to another. because they can transport it over a shorter distance. So in the case of Kleinpeter, our milk shed, it costs a pretty sizable amount to actually produce your milk and then to transport that milk from an outlying area to a city. You have to have a certain type of truck. You have to have a refrigerated tank. You have to have the processing ability. All that goes into transporting to get it to the people in the city. So naturally, those farmers are going to want to move their dairies as close to the city as possible. So on the Van Thunen model, we actually see the city in the complete center here. That's going to be your core area, your core city, something like downtown Baton Rouge. Outside of that, you've got what would be considered the Garden District. That would be the places where you're going to have a lot of small gardens, greenhouses. Next to that, outside of that one, you've got fuelwood. That's going to be fuel forests, places you can cut down the trees and produce the furniture or produce just regular wood to burn in your fireplace. Beyond that, farming. Now, some people switch farming and fuel wood depending on their circumstances, but this is kind of the basic version right here. Farming would be stuff like, cows, dairy, egg production, stuff that might cost a little bit more because you have to have certain things like refrigeration. Outside of that, ranching, because cows are heavy. You load up these cows to take them to slaughter. Well, guess what? One cow weighs about 600 to 700 pounds. You're taking 10 to 15 of them. So those pounds add up. And it's going to cost you more in fuel and in effort to get those cows to the slaughter. So from a ranch. And then beyond that, you have the wilderness. That's going to be the areas that are left untouched. Forested areas are just left to their own devices. We don't really settle those areas. So here's what Van Thunen model looks like if you actually put it into practice. So in this case, what you're seeing on this slide is you have a river in the center. Beyond that, you've got your main city center in the black area, that black dot there. Outside of that one, you've got horticulture and dairy, then forestry. Then you're going to have some massive areas for crop rotation, the bigger farms outside the city. And then on the very far end, you're going to have grazing areas or ranch areas. So here we have the Van Thunen model on one side, and that model modified by a river. How we would see that model looking today in an actual real life setting. All right, so your next slide, this is also on Google Classroom, called the Van Thunen Model Analysis. Here's what you're going to be doing with this one. Now, originally, I had planned for you guys to work in groups of 4. However, since you are not in groups of 4, you guys are going to have to actually be doing this on your own. The good news is I'm going to talk you through it. So, we've already talked about Van Thunen and the Van Thunen model. So, on this sheet, you actually have a what's called the Van Thunen reading, and you're going to be reading this play. I originally wanted you to discuss key points with each other, but unfortunately that's not going to be happening. So make sure you emphasize as you're reading it the key points of this theory, such as land costs and transportation costs. Once you've read over it, You guys are going to be doing the worksheet at the very end. It's the last 2 pages on here, 6 and 7. I've got it set up where you all have your own copy of it, so you can actually go in and type in your own information, your own answers, and from there you'll be able to actually go ahead and submit on Google Classroom. All right, so go ahead, read over this one, and at the very bottom, those last 2, go ahead and do these things. So you're going to go through these questions, rotating writers with each item. Unfortunately, we can't do that one. So you're going to rank the following crops: timber, dairy, grains, horticulture, and ranching. And you are going to list those 5 types of crops, starting with the ones that need the least amount of land to farm, and go from there. So go ahead and get this one done. You can pause the video at this point. You can pick up where we, in a second, you can unpause it once you're finished with this von Thunen thing. Be sure that you are turning it in on Google Classroom. That is mandatory, because that's one of the things that gets you your grade here. So go ahead and pause now. Do the von Thunen worksheet on Google Classroom. When you're done with that one, unpause and we'll continue. All right, now that you're done with the von Thunen sheet, real quick question. Other than physical geography, what could also change the shape of the von Thunen model? You've seen how we've changed it with those rings in a river area, but what are some other things that's going to change the shape and size of those rings? Go ahead and think about it. You can pause the video now, answer the question, and when you're done, you can unpause. We'll resume the video. All right, so slide 24, environmental challenges. One of our biggest problems is desertification or desertification. This is when we overuse our land, and because of this overuse, it leads to the area becoming an arid desert. We see this a lot in places where there's poor water management and climate change. In fact, on slide 24, you're actually seeing these 2 pictures. It's the same area, about 20 years apart. This is the Aral Sea in Eastern Europe. Now, sadly, that was the one on the right, the depleted sea, was taken a couple of years ago. It's actually shrunk a lot more since then. In fact, if you try to find it on Google Maps, you're barely going to be able to see anything there. It's essentially a sliver of what it used to be. All right, so poor water management, overuse of water, in this case with the Aral Sea, they've actually been pumping water from that sea to water crops. And as a result, overuse of that water, it's not being replenished. Especially with climate change changing the rain patterns in the area. So there's not enough rain to refill it to meet everyone's needs. From what I've heard, the Russian government has actually been working to try to fix this problem, because that's when a lot of this started, was when Russia was in the Soviet Union. They were using that water to supply places like St. Petersburg and Moscow. So Russia has been trying to get this thing reversed. They put a bunch of environmental rules in place about it. However, the damage is still there, and unless something changes drastically, then it's going to continue to be Here's one that's near and dear to Louisiana hearts. Slide 25, erosion. We see this with our Gulf Coast. And erosion is defined by geographers as the loss of the topmost layer of fertile soil. And this is a major problem with places with fragile soils, steep slopes, or heavy seasonal rain. In Louisiana, it's a major problem around the coastline because, unfortunately, all that coastline was created by the Mississippi River. And once we started building levees to hold the river in, it couldn't flood into those areas towards the south. It couldn't deposit new river silt and new sediment. And as a result, it actually started dying. And in fact, it's still dying today. They keep coming up with all these cockamamie ideas to try to get things done to fix the coast, but they've never considered the fact that they probably need to take down some parts of the levee. And you've probably noticed I'm getting a little bit more animated here because this is something that I care a lot about. I want to see Louisiana and our coastline restored because those areas are major not just for the environment but also for hunters, fishermen. You can take a boat. You can actually ride in a boat through all these areas. You could go to certain places, set up a duck blind, and be able to go duck hunting. Nowadays, there's not enough land to set up a duck blind. You have to stay in your boat. So it's rather tragic, and especially because there's such a seemingly simple solution. Take down some levees. Don't let the bayou, the Bonnie Carey spillway go into the Pontchartrain. Make it go south into those marsh and bayou areas and get that done. Now, here's our thing. Plants are going to be one of the big ones. Plants can actually prevent erosion by holding soil with their roots. In the case of Louisiana, we have numerous places where saltwater intrusion is happening. The salt water gets into these bayous and it kills the plants. Well, if the plant dies, then the roots aren't there to hold the soil anymore. And as a result, that soil gets washed away. So it's a major, major crisis Louisiana is going through. Hopefully they listen to our ecologists and our environmentalists and are able to rebuild that area simply by taking away part of the levee and letting the Mississippi River go back and flood those areas again. Slide 26, salinization. This is when the soil has excess salt in it. Typically in areas that require irrigation, as that water evaporates, they'll get their irrigation water from anywhere. And as that water evaporates, it leaves behind excess salt in the soil. So if you're pulling salt from or water from a sea that's got some salt in it, then eventually that water's going to be going to the plants. It gets evaporated, and what's left is salt. There's actually a few pictures if you go to Google, soil salinization. There's some pictures that look almost like snow on the ground. There's so much salt there. Now, this typically happens when the land is either flooded by seawater, or seawater seeps up through the land, or when brackish groundwater from the soil, which is that mixture of salt and fresh water, actually ends up depositing salt. The water gets pulled away, the salt's left. We don't see this happening too much in Louisiana, since we have a lot of fresh water sources that help wash that salt away. But in places like Wyoming, Colorado, this does happen from time to time. Slide number 27 is a map showing where these places are, where there's this salt salinization of the earth, the ground. As you can see in the United States, it doesn't happen a lot. However, you are seeing that one dark purple spot kind of towards the west. That's around Wyoming, Colorado. It does happen a little bit more there. Not so much because they have seawater because they're very much landlocked, but because a lot of these minerals and salts that are part of the Rocky Mountains are actually being flushed down into the valleys there. And what's happening is, as the water evaporates, the salt is left. As you're seeing on the map, the biggest place where this is happening is in Western Asia. You see where Iran, Iraq, but if you go north of where Afghanistan is, I think that's Turkmenistan, those places are actually starting to get, I think Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan as well. Those places are having a lot of salt intrusion simply because they were actually pumping water in from other places. Sometimes they had to pump water in from the sea. And as a result, the water evaporates and the salt is left. All right, and slide 28 is going to be your exit tickets. So with your exit ticket, based on what you've done today, I wanted you to, 1, describe the Van Thunen model in your own words, and 2, I want you to identify 2 countries we have not talked about in this class and explain the agricultural challenges that they're facing. This is going to require a little bit of research on your part. Try to find a country, maybe it's Thailand, maybe it's El Salvador. Either way, any country we have not talked about, I've not talked about briefly in this class, do a little bit of research and explain some of their agricultural challenges. All right, guys, so that's going to be the end of it. Make sure you're going through the entire Nearpod. Make sure you're doing the form at the bottom, or the Van Thunen worksheets that's on Google Classroom. All that is going to be going in for a grade. I'll try to get into those tonight and go ahead and get those graded and looked at. Beyond that, I'll see you later. I'm going to see if I can figure out what's going on with the live streaming so that I can actually do this in real time and answer your questions in real time. So, peace be with you. May the force be with you. Stay safe, stay well, and until we meet again, ta-ta for now.